So we're going to talk about backup offers. Hopefully this will be useful for agents, whether you're on the seller side or the buyer side, and a handful of things to know and to think about. So first of all, we're going to talk about the backup offer addendum. So this is a form in the standard forms library in California. But the first thing you need to know, even before we talk about that form, is if, say, you're on the buyer's side and the agent on the other side says, you know, we got your offer, thanks for your offer, they're not accepting it, but we're going to hold it in backup. You're like, great, we're in backup position. But what does that actually mean? So in the absence of this form, the backup offer addendum, it really doesn't mean anything. So it just means they appreciate it and they're going to hold on to it. It's going to stay on their desk. I don't know what it means, but it really doesn't mean anything contractually, I think is the main point. In the absence of the addendum, you don't really have anything if someone just tells you, we'll keep you in backup. You can ask what they mean if you think they're not going to do the addendum and you want to at least know where you stand with that other agent. Like, they're saying you're in backup. In their mind, what is that? And so I think you can be tactful with your questions, but in the absence of some paperwork, contractually it doesn't really mean anything and there's no actual protections for your buyer. From a negotiating standpoint, it's nice to know what they meant, but if you want any kind of contractual reassurances one way or the other, you would want to use this backup offer addendum, which we'll talk about. You want to know what it's meant when someone tells you that. And if you're the listing agent telling someone you're going to hold it in backup, be prepared for them to ask you for a backup offer addendum, or just you need to say, we're not going to do the backup offer addendum, but we'll keep you in mind if we have any trouble with the first offer. So you could go either way, just you want to know where you stand and be clear if you're on the listing agent. Giving that information out, just make it clear what you're really saying to the person on the other side, so you're setting expectations well. So let's talk about the addendum. So a few things you want to know. Well, there's some pros and cons. Why would you use that addendum? Why would you maybe not want to use that addendum? And so I think we can talk about a few of those. Hopefully it'll help you have that conversation with both buyer and seller of why you might or might not want to use it. So let's talk about some reasons why you would use it. First of all, when you're the seller, you might want to use it just because you want to keep that buyer engaged. That's a buyer that hasn't just been fully rejected. They're now actually contractually in this backup position. So they're keeping an eye on your property. They're thinking about your property. Sure, they might be looking at other properties in the meantime, but there's still more emotional attachment when there's a backup offer addendum. There's, of course, contractual attachment, but you're keeping that emotional attachment as well, which might be helpful if you really wanted to keep that buyer close to the property in case the first buyer doesn't go. You might have had multiple offers and the first 2 or 3 are actually really similar and really good. And sure, you did take one, but those others you, as a seller, would have been equally happy with, then a backup offer addendum is good just to keep them in the mix. And so that might not be the case if you have one that's a clear winner and another one that's marginal in second place. Maybe you don't want to do it in that case. But if you have multiple offers that are each great for their own reasons and perfectly acceptable from the seller's standpoint, then that would be a case to do it. Another reason you might consider it is just your read, both as an agent and the seller, on the market conditions. Like if you're the seller and you're thinking, there's not much chance we're gonna get a better offer than this second offer that we're rejecting, then maybe you should look at putting them in backup position. Certainly in a declining or softening market, this is much more the case. It's also the case in a softening or declining market, you're less likely to have multiple offers, so you don't encounter this as much in a slower market. But when you do, all the more reason you don't want to lose any buyer, let alone someone that gave you an offer. And so that could be a reason to give them that chance to have the backup position with the addendum. And the last thing I will say here, just as a reason you might want to have this person in backup position, sometimes the buyer that got their offer accepted is a lot more motivated, certainly more easy for you to negotiate with at the later stages of negotiation if you can say, I'm sorry you won all of these things from us now that we're in the middle of escrow. We actually have a backup offer addendum. You're welcome to cancel if this doesn't work for you anymore, but we would like to go forward with this other offer if you're not going to perform. So that's a much stronger negotiating position as a seller with your first buyer if you have that backup offer, as opposed to maybe otherwise being more inclined for that seller to kind of acquiesce to the buyer's requests around requests for repairs and other things. I would definitely recommend kind of watch our video on the multiple stages of negotiation in a real estate transaction. So we talk about 4, really 5 negotiating phases there. So take a look at that, you'll get a sense of what I mean. But that whole conversation is a lot simpler if you have a strong backup offer and you're not worried about that person in first position canceling. Now let's talk about some cons, why you maybe would not want to take a backup offer addendum, let's say as a seller. One is if you have a fast moving, in particular, a fast moving increasing market, like prices are getting better, there's more and more buyers kind of coming into the market, that's a great case where you probably don't want to tie the property up, or at least you might still for other reasons, but this would just be on the list of cons, right? That if this first buyer cancels, maybe the next buyer a few weeks from now or a month from now might be willing to pay a little bit more or be more aggressive on their terms. Like if you go back on the market, you're not worried about the market conditions being worse, that'd be a good argument for not binding your seller to a backup offer addendum. So that'd be one reason. Another one we mentioned a little bit earlier, which is just that kind of second place offer is quite a bit worse than the first one, either in timing, in just their type of financing or the price or whatever else it might be. If it's not close, it's quite a bit worse. There's not much advantage for the seller to go ahead and accept it. Maybe it's acceptable, it's right on the margin. Maybe the seller would actually prefer to go back on the market, then maybe they could do that. The last thing I would say is just a seller that wants to keep all their options open. The backup offer addendum is maybe not great in that scenario, right? If they're comfortable if they have to go back on the market and they just don't want to be tied up until they're tied, then a backup offer is not necessarily a great idea because it does, as you know, the contract is binding on the seller. The seller can't cancel an agreement unless the buyer has not performed in some way, right? So a backup offer means the first buyer has to fail to perform and get canceled. Now the second buyer is in place. Now that the seller's stuck with that second buyer, so they have to really like that offer, presuming that that buyer performs. If the seller just like, I want to keep my options open, then maybe the backup offer addendum is probably not going to be attractive to them. So now that we've gone through the pros and cons of would you or would you not want to do the backup offer addendum, we're going to talk about a couple other things just to keep in mind, a little bit more of just logistics associated with this form. So in our examples, as we've talked so far, we talked about just a second place buyer. Theoretically, you could have a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth person in backup. There's a spot on the form where you indicate which position they're in. All the people before them would have had to cancel before they have the option. But just keep that in mind, we have seen people do a pretty deep stack of backup offer addendums. The other thing to keep in mind is just because you got 2 offers, you don't have to accept one and then accept the other in backup. You can accept one and then continue countering with the other, provided that your counter includes a backup offer addendum. So basically saying, we're willing to go into backup position with you, buyer number 2, but only if you change your price to this, or you change your down payment to this, or whatever other terms you're going to counter them on. So you can accept an offer and then continue negotiating for backup positions with others. So keep that in mind. Also, you may get an offer while your property is in escrow. You can take that offer in a backup position even though you didn't receive the offers at the same time. So meaning you can counter and have that negotiation, you just have to make sure that the backup offer is included. Just a really finer point here is that when you counter, you need to make sure that the backup offer addendum is an addendum and is attached to your counter. So you're saying we're only agreeing to accept your offer if you, buyer, accept this backup offer addendum. That way you're avoiding the chance of essentially obligating your seller to 2 buyers, the one they're in contract with already, and now potentially the second one. So the second one is the whole backup offer addendum. What it does is it makes their acceptance conditioned on the cancellation of the first one, so you don't have to worry about them getting in contract with 2 people at the same time, or getting obligated to sell to 2 people at the same time. Very last point regarding these backup offers is, we talked about countering. So a lot of times when you have a backup offer addendum, you've maybe just done the counter and the backup offer addendum. Just keep in mind, actually the entirety of the contract does need to be initialed and signed by the buyer that's going into backup position. So you should have a fully completed contract with that buyer. That's the RPA, any counters, so the RPA signed by buyer and seller, any counters signed by buyer and seller, and that backup addendum clarifying what position they're in. also signed by buyer and seller. So with that, hope that helps. We covered some pros and cons, also talked about some logistics associated with the backup offer addendum. It can be a great tool, just a way that you can bring your expertise into the transaction to help your clients. And so with that, that's it for the backup offers, and we'll see you in the next video.